Imagine you are 66 years old and you have been on Medicare for about a year. You went with the Medicare Advantage plan because, honestly, who would not? The premium was $0. It had dental, it had vision, and the commercial made it look like the obvious choice. Then your doctor tells you that you need a procedure, nothing catastrophic, but not minor either. And you start getting bills, co-payments, co-insurance, a prior authorization that takes 3 weeks and gets partially denied. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, someone mentions that you might have been better off with a supplement plan. But switching now with your current health history could be complicated. That is the conversation this video is about. Today, we are going to walk through the real difference between Medicare Advantage and Medicare Supplement insurance. I am going to call it Medigap for the rest of this video because that is what most people call it. We are going to look at how these plans actually work when you need care, not just what they look like on a brochure. And we are going to talk about the one timing rule that most people do not find out about until it is too late. Here is what you are going to walk away with today. First, the structural difference between Medicare Advantage and Medigap, explained in plain English. Second, why the monthly premium comparison almost never tells the whole story. Third, the 6-month window that changes everything, and what happens after it closes. Fourth, a real-life comparison using 2 fictional people and 2026 numbers. Fifth, a simple 4-question framework you can use right now to figure out which path makes sense for your life. Stay with me until the end because I am going to give you a simple checklist you can answer at the kitchen table. Here is a number that might surprise you. As of early 2026, more than 35 million Americans are enrolled in Medicare Advantage. That is more than half of everyone eligible for Medicare, and that number has been growing fast. It grew from about 8 million people back in 2007 to where it is today. Now, I am not telling you that to say Medicare Advantage is bad, because it is not for many people. What I am telling you is that this has become the default choice for a huge portion of Americans. And most of them made that choice based on one number, which is the monthly premium, often $0. But here is what the enrollment data also shows us. In 2023, the most recent year with complete data, about 6% of all Medicare beneficiaries had no supplemental coverage at all. That means no Medigap, no Medicare Advantage, just raw, original Medicare. And 13% of those in traditional Medicare were in the same situation. Under original Medicare alone, there is no cap on what you can owe out of pocket. A single hospitalization can mean thousands of dollars in cost sharing, which is a serious financial risk. So the question is not really whether Medicare Advantage is popular, because it is. The question is whether that choice was made with a full understanding of how each type of coverage actually works. And the rules for changing your mind later matter a lot more than the premium does. Let me explain this simply. Think of original Medicare, Parts A and B, as a house with some rooms missing a roof. It covers a lot, including doctors, hospitals, outpatient care, and preventative services, but it does not cover everything. It leaves you with real gaps, including deductibles, co-insurance, and co-payments that can add up quickly. And unlike most private insurance, there is no annual out-of-pocket maximum in original Medicare alone. Now, you have got 2 main ways to deal with those gaps, and they work very differently from each other. The first option is Medicare Advantage, which is also called Part C. When you enroll in a Medicare Advantage plan, you are essentially handing your Medicare card to a private insurance company. That company takes over your coverage, and they cover Part A, Part B, and usually Part D prescription drugs, all in one bundled plan. Many of them add extras like dental, vision, and hearing, which are benefits original Medicare does not cover at all. In 2026, about 67% of Medicare Advantage prescription drug plans carry no additional monthly premium beyond what you pay for Part B. That is the $0 premium you see in the commercials, and it is real, but it comes with trade-offs. Most Medicare Advantage plans are HMOs or PPOs, meaning you generally need to use doctors in the plan's network. You may need referrals to see specialists, and many services require something called prior authorization. Prior authorization means the insurance company has to approve the care before it happens, and they can deny that request or take weeks to process it. The second option is a Medigap supplement plan, and this one works completely differently from Medicare Advantage. You keep original Medicare. The government pays its share of your bills directly, and there is no network, no prior authorization, and no referrals required. Your Medigap policy then steps in and covers the gaps, including the deductibles, the coinsurance, and the copayments. You can see any doctor or hospital in the country that accepts Medicare. And according to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, more than 93% of physicians do. The trade-off is simple. Because Medigap costs more every month, but your costs at the point of care become far more predictable. Neither of these options is automatically better, and they are genuinely different philosophies about how your healthcare works. One optimizes for a low monthly bill, and the other optimizes for predictability and freedom of access when you need care. The right choice depends on how you use your healthcare, what your health looks like, and where you are in your Medicare enrollment timeline. All right, this is the section I really want you to pay attention to because the traps here are not obvious. They are the kind of thing you only find out about when it is too late to avoid them easily. The first trap is what I call the closing window, and it is the most important one to understand. When you turn 65 and enroll in Medicare Part B, federal law gives you a 6-month window called your Medigap open enrollment period. During those 6 months, any insurance company that sells Medigap policies in your state is legally required to sell you one. They cannot ask about your health, they cannot charge you more because of a pre-existing condition, and they cannot deny you coverage. That window is a one-time event, and it does not repeat every year like the Medicare open enrollment period in the fall. After those 6 months close, in most states, Medigap insurers can do medical underwriting. They can review your health history, your prescription drug records, and your diagnoses, and they can legally deny your application. According to KFF Health News reporting from early 2026, Medigap underwriting has tightened in recent years. Insurers are increasingly running prescription drug background checks as a primary part of their evaluation process. So here is how this trap works in real life, and it is more common than most people realize. Someone turns 65, gets bombarded by Medicare Advantage advertising, signs up for a zero premium plan, and thinks they can always switch later. For some people, that is true, particularly if they stay healthy and live in one of the 21 states that offers some form of annual guaranteed issue Medigap access. But in most of those states, those rights only apply to switching between existing Medigap plans, not to entering from Medicare Advantage. For most Americans who develop a significant health condition while on Medicare Advantage, that door may be effectively closed or may cost substantially more to walk through. The second trap is what I call the $0 illusion, and it is easy to fall into. A $0 monthly premium sounds like no cost, but Medicare Advantage plans have cost sharing built right in. In 2026, the maximum allowable out-of-pocket limit for in-network costs under Medicare Advantage is $9,250. That is the ceiling the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services sets on what plans are allowed to charge you in a single year. Most plans set their actual maximums well below that ceiling, but it still means your exposure in a bad health year could run into thousands of dollars. Compare that to a Medigap Plan G, which is the most comprehensive option available to new Medicare enrollees today. Under Plan G, once you have satisfied the annual Part B deductible of $283 in 2026, the plan covers essentially all remaining cost sharing. No co-payments at the doctor's office, no co-insurance for a hospital stay, and no surprise bills from a specialist visit. You pay more every month for that predictability, but in a year with a significant hospitalization or multiple specialist visits, the math can shift considerably. The third trap is simple, but it trips people up, and that is the fact that you cannot have both plans at the same time. Federal law prohibits having Medicare Advantage and a Medigap policy simultaneously, and a Medigap policy cannot pay Medicare Advantage copayments, deductibles, or premiums. If you enroll in Medicare Advantage and keep an old Medigap policy, thinking it will provide a backup, it will not work, and you will be paying for coverage you cannot use. The fourth trap involves prescription drug coverage, and it catches a lot of people off guard. Medigap policies sold after 2005 do not include prescription drug coverage, so you need to purchase a standalone Medicare Part D plan separately. The good news is that starting in 2026, out-of-pocket drug costs under Part D are capped at $2,100 per year. That is a meaningful protection added by the Inflation Reduction Act, but it is still a separate decision and a separate premium on top of your other costs. Medicare Advantage plans, on the other hand, typically bundle Part D coverage right into the plan, which is genuinely convenient for many people. Let me introduce you to two people who both did the right thing and still ended up in very different situations. Meet Carol, age 65, and her neighbor Dennis, also 65, who both live in the same mid-sized city in Ohio. They both enroll in Medicare on the same month, and they are both in reasonably good health with no major diagnoses. Dennis goes with a Medicare Advantage HMO plan, 0 additional monthly premium, Part D bundled in, and dental and vision included. His total monthly Medicare cost is $202.90, which is just the standard Part B premium every Medicare enrollee pays in 2026. Carol looks at the same 0 premium plan and decides instead to go with Medigap Plan G. Her monthly premium for Plan G is $165, which we're using as a mid-range national average estimate for a 65-year-old woman in 2026. She also picks up a standalone Part D plan for $35 a month, so her total monthly Medicare cost is about $403. That includes the $202.90 Part B premium, plus $165 for Plan G, plus $35 for Part D. Now let us run 2 years and see how the numbers actually play out for both of them. In year 1, both Carol and Dennis stay healthy, with a few doctor visits, 1 specialist, and annual preventive care. Dennis pays very little in co-payments, maybe $50 to $100 total for the year, and Carol satisfies her $283 Part B deductible. Dennis comes out ahead by roughly $150 to $200 for the year because his lower monthly cost wins when healthcare use is modest. In year 2, Carol has a health event. Nothing life-threatening, but she needs a minor surgical procedure and 3 days in the hospital. Under her Plan G, she has already satisfied her Part B deductible, and everything else is covered. So her total out-of-pocket for that entire year of care is $283. Dennis has the same health event, and under his Medicare Advantage HMO, he faces a hospital copayment, surgical copayment, and specialist visit copayments. These costs vary by plan, but under a typical Medicare Advantage cost-sharing structure in 2026, a hospitalization plus follow-up care could reasonably result in $2,000 to $4,000 out of pocket. In this scenario, Carol's more expensive monthly premium has more than paid for itself in that single year of care. But the most important part of this story is not year 2. It is year 7. By then, Dennis has settled into his Medicare Advantage plan and has had some health changes, including a diabetes diagnosis and some blood pressure medication. He starts to hear about Medigap from a friend who tells him that Carol never gets surprise bills. He looks into switching, and that is when he finds out about the underwriting rules. He is past his 6-month open enrollment period by years, so he applies for a Medigap policy and the insurer runs a prescription drug background check. Because of his diagnoses and current medications, he's either denied coverage or quoted a significantly higher premium than Carol has been paying since day one. According to KFF Health News, patient advocates now specifically warn Medicare beneficiaries to factor in the underwriting risk before choosing Medicare Advantage. Dennis is not a cautionary tale about making the wrong choice because he made a reasonable decision with the information he had at the time. He just did not know about the closing window, and that is exactly why we are having this conversation today. All right, I promised you a practical tool, and here it is. The Uncle John 4-question checkup. You can do this right now with a piece of paper and a pen, and you do not need a financial advisor to answer these questions. Question 1 is this: where am I in the enrollment timeline? Write down when you first enrolled in Medicare Part B, and if you enrolled at 65, count 6 months from that date. Is that window still open? Because if yes, you have time to enroll in Medigap on a guaranteed issue basis, meaning no one can deny you or charge you more for your health. If that window has already closed, you are not necessarily stuck, but your options are different. So write down the answer clearly. Question 2 is this: what does my healthcare use actually look like? Be honest with yourself here. Because if you have ongoing conditions requiring regular specialist visits or hospitalizations, predictable cost sharing becomes very valuable. The higher your actual healthcare use, the more the monthly Medigap premium starts to look like a fair and sensible trade. Question 3 is this: are my doctors in network for the specific Medicare Advantage plan I am considering? Not just Medicare in general, but the specific plan, because network rosters change every year, and your doctors may not always be included. If your doctors are not in network, you may face higher costs or need to switch providers, which is a significant disruption for many people. Question 4 is this: what state do I live in? Because state law matters more in Medicare than most people realize. A handful of states, including Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and several others, have expanded Medigap protections that give residents more flexibility to switch plans. As of 2026, 21 states offer at least some form of annual guaranteed issue access, so check your state's rules before assuming the federal baseline is your only option. Your local SHIP counselor, which stands for State Health Insurance Assistance Program, can help you understand exactly what is available where you live. This service is completely free and available in every state, and you can find your local program at medicare.gov. That is the framework. 4 questions, and you just need to sit down and be honest with yourself to work through them. Now, if you have worked through those 4 questions and want to go deeper, here are a few things worth knowing. First, Medigap policies are standardized by letter, meaning a Plan G from one company offers the same core benefits as a Plan G from another company. What is different is the premium, and that can vary by hundreds of dollars per year between insurers offering the exact same coverage, so it is worth comparing carefully. Your local SHIP counselor has access to comparison tools that can help you find the best price for identical coverage in your area. Second, if you are newly enrolling in Medicare and you try Medicare Advantage for the first time, federal law gives you a 12-month trial period. During that trial period, you can leave the Medicare Advantage plan and return to original Medicare with a guaranteed right to purchase a Medigap policy, no underwriting required. That is a meaningful safety net. So if you are within your first 12 months in Medicare Advantage and having second thoughts, talk to someone before that window closes. Third, whether you are in Medicare Advantage or Medigap, you should review your prescription drug plan every fall during the annual enrollment period, which runs from October 15th through December 7th. Formularies change every year, and a drug that was fully covered this year may be in a different tier or dropped from the list entirely next year. For more complex situations, especially if you are weighing income thresholds, Social Security timing, or retirement account strategy alongside your Medicare choices, working with a qualified fiduciary financial planner is a smart move. These strategies interact in ways that are genuinely hard to model on your own, and professional guidance can make a real difference. I want to leave you with a simple image to carry with you after this video. Imagine two doors at the start of Medicare, and both doors are open right now for anyone entering the program. One leads to Medicare Advantage, with lower monthly costs, bundled convenience, and a network managing your care. The other leads to Original Medicare, plus a Medigap supplement, with higher monthly cost, no network, no prior authorizations, and predictable bills. You can walk through either door, and both are real options that work well for real people, depending on their circumstances. But here is the thing about the second door, and this is the part I really want you to remember. The further you walk down the Medicare Advantage hallway, the harder it becomes to come back and open that Medigap door again. It does not lock for everyone, but for people whose health has changed, it can become very difficult, or in some cases, nearly impossible to walk through on the original terms. The goal of this video was never to tell you which door to choose, and I want to be clear about that. It was to make sure you know both doors exist, that you understand what is behind each one, and that you are aware of the timing before making a decision that is hard to undo. You are doing the right thing by learning this now, because this stuff is genuinely complicated. The insurance industry spends billions of dollars every year making Medicare Advantage look simple and obvious, and understanding the full picture takes more than a 30-second commercial. A quick and important note before you go, because everything in this video is educational information only. It is not personal tax advice, legal advice, financial advice, or Medicare counseling specific to your situation. Medicare rules, premiums, and plan availability change every year, and your circumstances are unique in ways I cannot know from a YouTube video. Please speak with a qualified fiduciary financial planner, a licensed Medicare insurance counselor, or your local SHIP program for guidance tailored to your specific situation. SHIP counseling is completely free, and you can find your local program at medicare.gov. If this video helped you see this decision more clearly, please give it a like, because it helps other people find this channel who need exactly this kind of conversation. Subscribe to Uncle John Financial so you do not miss what is coming next. And here is what I would love you to do in the comments. Leave the word window if you are still inside your 6-month Medigap enrollment period. Or leave the word door if you are past it and trying to figure out what your options are from here. I read every comment, and it helps me understand what you need most from this channel. Take care of yourselves, and we will talk again soon.